She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For their morning, the day is dawning. For Cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back now, me now a come home. Inaga, jackass yard to fetch a load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. So now go down.
All right. Hey, guess what? It's, of course, by now you all know that it's a new year. And we're back with our regular program called Anansi Web Education, where we talk about things happening to folks out there in the villages, whether under quarantine, whether in the rural, out in the other parts of Guyana, to give you a feeling as to how people are feeling the squeeze, as we would say in Guyana, feeling the squeeze. Today's topic we want to touch on the issue of why were 4 school children injured? Why were 4 school children injured and had to be rushed to hospital after People's Progressive Party PPP rioters pelted their bus? So that's the question we want to ask, and I'm glad that our operator was able to bring President David Arthur Granger on with us. President Granger, again, Happy New Year and welcome to our program, Anansi Web Education.
Thank you very much for the welcome. It's always a pleasure to be on this program to advance the cause of education on issues that affect our people, particularly those in the villages. Thank you, and I hope we have a good year together.
Thank you, and to all our listeners as well. I hope we all of us have that good year together, a really, really good year in unity. Now it says here, and as we reflect back on what happened not so long ago in 2020, because people are asking the question, why would supporters of any political party, but what we've observed is supporters of the PPPC, they were, vicious enough in attacking when they attacked that school bus with school children. And this is what we're touching on today. Why were 4 school children injured and had to be rushed to the hospital after People's Progressive Party rioters pelted their school bus in broad daylight on Friday, the 6th of March 2020, on the public road in Bushlat, region number 5. What did those children do to deserve? And that's a good question. What did those children do to deserve such violent injury? Violent injury, as the evidence would show. That's just one child. One child. Their school bus was actually attacked by rioters, PPP rioters, in West Coast Berbice, Bushlat. And so we're dealing with the violence now seems to be endemic. The origins of civil violence can be traced to the PPP's hurricane of protest, 1964, which came to be known as the Disturbances. This was perhaps the earliest episode and most gruesome example of civil disorder. Violence thereafter beset the political landscape, leaving lingering legacy of distrust and a propensity for disorder. Hence, what we saw PPP rioters did in 2020 after the 2020 elections. These memories are still fresh in our minds, fresh, attacking school buses and so forth. Let's begin our program today of Anansi. President Granger, first, I'd like to ask, how did New Year begin before we get straight into our question? How is your New Year so far, sir?
Well, thank you for the question. It's always been quiet. My wife and I had a very quiet New Year. The neighboring village seems to have access to some pyrotechnics. So there was some noise at the midnight hour. But, unfortunately, I haven't been going into church. I haven't been into any public engagements for quite a while. But in the past, we would go to church at midnight on Holy Year's night, but I haven't been able to do that for several years for reasons which the public knows and understands. But
all right, good. Yeah, good.
Uneventful.
Yeah. And as we begin our question here now, questions, January 24th marks the 60th anniversary of the outbreak of the disturbances. And, as we will, and we have suggested here in forthcoming programs, we will be dealing with the outbreak of the disturbances. And our programs will be aimed at answering the following questions. Who was responsible, Mr. Granger, as we begin our first question, who was responsible for the invention of civil violence in Guyana?
It's a good place to start, and I think all of us who grew up in the countryside, and certainly people of my age, would accept that we have never had that type of violence in the country before the mid-1960s. Guyana was a safe place. We mightn't have been rich, but there was no thought of a neighbor attacking another, attacking his or her neighbor because of a political affiliation. There was no widespread violence. You always had a bit of hooliganism, but from the mid-1960s, you definitely had a clear indication that the People's Progressive Party was bent on total control of society. And it did so because the electoral system, for a variety of reasons that we don't have to go into now, created the illusion that they were unbeatable. They felt they would continue to get huge majorities. And the old electoral system was what they call first past the post. And under the constituency system, although they got minorities in the country as a whole, they got majorities in the Legislative Assembly. And this was an anomaly because the worst case was in 1961 elections when the PPP got just about 43% of the votes and got 57% of the seats. And the United Force and the PNC together got 57% of the votes and got 42% of the seats. So the system was clearly unbalanced and unfair. And the PPP felt that they could do what they liked. And that is what gave them this impression that they were, they couldn't be removed and they could do what they liked to this country. And I would say that there's no doubt in my mind that given the safety which Guyanese enjoyed up to the mid-60s, things changed. Once there was internal self-government and the PPP felt assured that they will continue getting, majorities because of the electoral system, they embarked on violence in order to extend their control of the population and of the trade unions. But there's no doubt in my mind that the PPP is solely responsible, and they train people to enforce that vision that they had, total domination. It's something they inherited from Leninism, not Marxism. They're not Marxists, they're Leninists. They just believe in control and domination.
Believe in control and domination. We see the evidence every day. The PPP believes in control and domination, and that is very, very bad for democracy. We move on to the next question, Mr. Granger. What factors led to the introduction of civil violence in Guyana? But just before you answer that question, let me just welcome all of our listeners, those who just joined us. Happy New Year to all of you, and welcome to Anansi Web Education. Mr. Granger, again, the second question, very important, like the first one. What factors led to the introduction of civil violence in Guyana?
My view is that the most important factor was the PPP commitment to total control of society. And it was prepared to use violence to enforce that control or to make that control possible. One, they wanted to control the labor movement. And we used to have a lot of free unions. But the main union that the PPP had was the GIW, which originally was established by Joseph Lachman Singh, who later on became chairman of the PNC, and they changed the name to, well, they reformed it and called it the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union. But the PPP intended to use the union, particularly GAU, as the shock troops of their political campaign. And in the countryside, particularly, what used to be peaceful coexistence among villagers and among villages, became very tense and later on became very violent. I would say that the main factor was the PPP insistence on total control. The second factor, of course, was, as I mentioned a minute ago, was the electoral system, which was unbalanced and which continued to give the PPP in 1953, 1957, 1961, huge majorities, which in the legislative council or the legislative assembly, which did not reflect the amount of votes they were getting in the electorate. So they were able to get the 57% of the seats in the National Assembly or the Legislative Assembly, as it's called then, with only 43%, and they felt that they could go on doing this forever. So I would say that frustration at not being able to control society, that there were people in the trade union, there was a strong, what was then called the British Guiana Civil Service Association, the CSA. There was strong GLU at that time. It was affiliated to, it was under, I think Mr. Burnham was the honorary president at one stage, the union formed by Hubert Critchlow. Many of the unions were really free organizations representing the workers. But the PPP was not accustomed to dealing with that type of freedom, people talking back to them. They wanted something that they could dictate to, the control. So that was an important factor that, that gave them this notion. The other thing is that by being a Leninist party, Leninism does not accommodate, democratic conversation and exchange of views. Leninism is based on domination, based on control, it's based on dictation. And for one reason or the other, the PPP, I don't want to accuse anybody of any ideological crime, but the PPP was convinced that, I think up to now, there's still a debate about Leninism as a part of the PPP Constitution 2024. I think recently a senior member of the PPP said that if you want to remove it, that's a matter for the PPP Congress. Well, the PPP doesn't have Congress anymore. So it is still on paper a Leninist party, and Leninism is antithetical to democracy. Leninism means that one party would hold the government and control every aspect, the unions, the schools, the economy, every aspect. So the PPP adherence up to 2024 to this notion of Leninism, and my friend, we must separate Leninism from Marxism. They're two different things. Karl Marx is not a Leninist. Leninist Lenin was a political revolutionary who believed in total control of the state. They're two different things. And the PPP has abandoned Marxism and embraced Leninism. So I would say that because of that philosophy, it felt it could use violence. And when you read what Lenin says about violence against class enemies, you'd see that the PPP is living out its Leninist mission. And the fact that very many members at the hierarchy of the PPP were trained in the People's Friendship University of Moscow. They were trained in a Leninist way of thinking. Uh, it was used to be called the Patrice Lumumba University, but many of our present leaders in the PPP are graduates of that thinking, of that institution, and that mentality. So I would say that they were prepared to use violence because violence, fulfills the class aspirations, what they call the class aspirations of the vanguard party, that's the PPP. Nothing else counts as long as the PPP wins.
Nothing else counts as long as the PPP wins. Uh, Again, good night and good to see you guys. Those new viewers that we have, listeners that we have, we are thankful that you have joined us this year, 2024. And the violence is still fresh. This, not so long ago, in 2020, PPP rioters, then stoning of a school bus, injuring several young school children. Um, See, these are facts. The evidence is there for you guys to see. Policemen were injured in 2020, not 1960 or 1970s or whatever. In 2020, these things happen. Well, let's move on to the next question as we're dealing with the outbreak of the disturbances, not just of 1964, but 2020. The next question, President Granger, where has the PPP GAU violence had its gravest and greatest impact? As we shift now and we let our listeners know, GAU is the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, a union that is pro-PPP, so to speak. Well, not so to speak, the evidence is there. But Mr. Granger, that question?
Well, I can say that the question answers itself because the very fact that GAU is essentially a rural-based union suggests that the impact would be on the countryside. The correct title now, it's been amended over the years, now Guyana Agriculture and General Workers Union. But it is well known that the bulk of its support comes from rural workers who reside sugar workers who reside in rural areas. It means that their activities, their strength, their support, their membership comes from rural communities. Now, in my view, having lived part of my life in rural Guyana, I would say it was peaceful. I mean, you could literally go to sleep with your doors open, doors and windows open. There was very little crime, and there certainly was no political or violent crime. Occasionally, people would get drunk and they'd create some type of disorder, but that wasn't widespread. it wasn't methodical, it wasn't systematic. But from 1961, and those persons living on the quarantine would remember that there was something called a victory parade, a victory cavalcade in August 1961, when there was a convoy coming from Crabwood Creek to Georgetown, and there was a lot of unpleasantness. There's a lot of unpleasantness, and for the first time, people on the quarantine, which used to be regarded as a PPP stronghold, became aware of the fact that they were different Guyanese. You know, it wasn't as if we were all together. Many families had intermarried and all that, but when they looked at that procession from Crabwood Creek, they actually tied, in one scene, there was a caiman. It was tied to one of the vehicles and painted black. Well, it was a black caiman anyway, and it was dragged through the road, of course, until it was dead. And they called that caiman a PNC, you know. So people became very worried from the mid 1960s, and it meant that wherever Gawu was, throughout the sugar belt, and that time sugar belt was more or less between Iflot and Skeldon, because you still had significant sugar production in West Demerara, East Demerara, West Berbice, and East Berbice in the 1960s. Wherever Gawu was present, I think indicated that there would be impact, because Gawu definitely was being used by the PPP for as shock troops for their the campaign of violence. And a well-known historian who is from the quarantine pointed this out in plain words. He said the PPP was using the sugar workers as the shock troops in their political battles. And that was one of the reasons why I would say that the PPP Gawo violence has the greatest impact in rural Guyana, in the countryside, particularly in the sugar belt. It didn't affect the hinterland, and to some extent, it didn't affect the people up the rivers for a long time. That's another story we'll come to later on. But definitely the sugar belt, anything between Iflot and I think Crabwood Creek or Skeldon became almost in some areas a battle zone. In some areas it was a battle zone. And when we discuss this matter more deeply, there were problems then. People couldn't even go into other villages without being attacked. In the 1960s, we still had a coastal railway running between Rosignol and Amsterdam, between Rosignol and Georgetown, and between Breedenhoop and Perico. And some people were afraid even to use the trains, because when they stopped at the train station, it could be attacked. But it was a rural problem. The train line ran through rural areas. And that is the problem, because that was the most peaceful part of the country up to the mid 1960s. So that is where the impact was heaviest, most gravest. And I think in later programs, we'll examine in detail where the attacks took place and why there's a lingering legacy of distrust and fear. In fact, I'm not surprised. I'm very disappointed and very upset that the clip you showed about the stoning of the school bus, in West Berbice. But I would say without a doubt that is It's unlikely to have happened to have occurred in Georgetown. It's unlikely to have occurred in Georgetown. That's definitely rural.
All right, as we prepare to wind down our program here on Anansi Web Education with President, His Excellency President David Arthur Granger. We're talking about the violence, especially recent violence. We saw what PPP rioters did in West Coast Berbice, Bushlat, and the stoning of a school bus, injuring several young students, the beating up of policemen and women, nurses, all these things under the PPP regime. By PPP supporters, rioters. The final question for tonight, Mr. Granger: why did the disturbances leave such a lingering impact on society?
There are several reasons. One is that the PPP felt it was legitimate to use violence to further their political objectives. And it has not changed that ideology that the important objective is seizing state power. And anything goes, anything is legitimate. Any form of dishonesty, any form of criminality, any form of violence, as long as you got power in the end. And when we look at the later development of the disturbances, you see that the violence was ruthless. It was callous and ruthless. The second thing is that it was weaponized. These are not people who were stoning one another. These are people who brought machine guns into the country. These are people who sent, young men, including African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, overseas to be trained in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. So we had people with weapons and we had people with the training. This sort of thing never happened before. Because you're not only weaponizing violence, you're also training almost, you can say, a private army of terrorists to conduct that violence. And in addition to that, many of the victims were ordinary Guyanese. Schoolboy walking through a village, farmer going to the back dam, old folk coming, in some bateau or corial from their farms. So it was almost, as one philosopher said, banal. That people, kill she, and you can see that it has sort of lingered in the way a lot of males treat their women. Almost every week, you can see a woman being treated in a way as if her life doesn't matter. And I think that I've never seen that before the 1960s. That people taking that political attitude into the house. That the woman, or the child, or even sometimes at the wedding house, it doesn't matter what violence. And you keep showing this scene here. This is on the 6th of March 2020, and there were 6 riots. There were 6 coordinated riots. These were not spontaneous. You can see one riot could be spontaneous, but when 6 riots occur almost at the same time, it's like clockwork. So that methodical approach was one of the reasons why this planned violence has had such a lingering impact on society. But the most important thing is that the mindset of the leaders of the PPP has not changed. And they are prepared to use any means, legal or illegal, to attack their critics and to maintain office, maintain power. And unless we have some form of social cohesion to erase that mindset, to remove that mindset, we'll be dealing with disturbances for a long time. But the legacy of disturbances, not on the scale of 1964. And this is a very dark anniversary for many people. I know people who still have albums of photographs of the relatives who were killed or brutalized in 1964. This is not what Guyanese history should be about. It should be about building a future for our children. But unless the PPP accepts the need for social cohesion, don't provide this corridor of unity and one Guyana. What we need is to sit down and treat one another with respect, treat one another as equals, and solve the problems of cooperation and cohesion. But sitting down in Parliament with a big placard, like the social cohesion in the past, many people believe that social cohesion, many of their supporters believe that social cohesion in the past, so they do nothing to advance social cohesion. The result is that we have social division. And anybody looking again over the last 40 months could see that social division has deepened. Because the PPP has not abandoned its resistance to social cohesion, which the APNU AFC advanced rigorously from 2015, literally from day one. But what you see there in March the 6th is really a rejection of the social cohesion which is needed for any society to survive.
Thank you so much. But before we go, though, Mr. Granger, some people might be asking, how important is this subject today, and why? Why is it important to remind Guyanese, especially the younger Guyanese? Why?
It is the anniversary. It is the 60th anniversary of the outbreak of the disturbances. And like anybody, remembers his or her birthday, unfortunately, this is a very dark event. But we must remember it to prevent its recurrence. We must remember it to see what damage it has done, and we must decide that it must never happen again. And unfortunately, people do not like to hear about it because they like to point fingers and say, we are not to blame, or those poor people are to blame. It's not a matter of blame. It is a matter of accepting that violence is sick. And Guyana, with its petroleum revenue, Guyana, with its abundant resources, does not require this type of violence, which we have seen, which we did see in 1964. Children have to be taught. I mean, the United States, children are taught about the Civil War in order to make sure that the causes of the Civil War do not lead to another conflict in Northern Ireland, all over the world. And what we see now in places like Gaza, I mean, the issues there have never been settled from the time of the so-called Israeli, the independence of the state of Israel. And this violence will solve nothing. And the disturbances as an episode of violence solve nothing. In fact, I would add that in 2000 up to 2010, what we call the Troubles was really a replay, a reenactment of the violence of the disturbances. When we saw the callous disregard for human life, because we did not learn the lessons of 1964. And in 2002, we were repeating the same mistakes. We are seeing situations in which armed gunmen were going out killing people in order to further some criminal enterprise. And it meant that at least in 2002, 2004, we still had not learned the lessons of the disturbances. So that is why we mustn't forget. We must teach our children that violence will not solve the communal problems, the social problems of this country. And we must repudiate the things that happened. There's nothing pleasant about there's no winner or loser in 1964 disturbances. The system that PPP fought and killed to prevent, the PR system, is still the system we're working with today. It's not the Barbados system, it's not the Grenada system, not the St. Vincent system, but it's our system. And since 1964, December to 1960, to 2024, we still have this essentially the same system. Of course, it needs to be improved, but people died for PR in this country, and we must make sure that the lessons of the disturbances are not lost on the present generation. We do not need to kill. We do not need to hate. We do not need to reject social cohesion if we're to move this country forward and to give our next generation an opportunity to overcome these errors of the leaders of the past. That is what we need to do. Think of the future and avoid the recurrence of the disturbances. And unfortunately, for those of us who are living, know that an attempt was made in the 2000s, the first decade of this millennium, to repeat the same violence, and a lot of it affected the rural areas. Certain villages in particular suffered greatly from the troubles, and they suffered greatly from the troubles from the disturbances in 1964. So it seems that history is likely to be repeated unless we teach our children not to hate and not to embrace violence at schools and at home or in the street.
All right, President David Arthur Granger there. Thank you so much for your time, and for all of our listeners there. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here with us on Anansi Web Education. Looking forward to have you guys back with us again next week, right here on 107.1 FM. Mr. Granger, thank you so much, and please give our regards to your wife, former First Lady, Sandra Marie Granger. Thank you so much, sir.
It's always a pleasure to be on the program.
All right, guys, we'll see you guys next week, right here on 107.1 FM. God bless. Have a great rest of the evening.
She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frock, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. Forgot a crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Cock a crow, dog a bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh.